So welcome back. Hope you took a break, stretch your legs, do that between the videos. I certainly did. So let's just get straight into it. In this section, what I want to do is really examine something that I suspect we think we know. What does it mean to be a lawyer, and what do we mean when we talk about the legal profession? So this word profession is really quite interesting. In fact, those of you who love a bit of Bridgerton and the odd period drama, there was a long time where being a member of a profession was seen as, by the elites as being a little bit dirty, a little bit grubby. And professionals at that, they tended to then separate themselves again on the kind of, and I'm taking this very much from a Anglo-European approach, they separated themselves and were a little bit haughty and high and mighty above merchants, who again would look down through past their ledgers, I guess, down to people who were craftsmen, or then tradespeople, or then further down labourers, etc. So we've had this idea of a profession for a very long time. At the same time, even though we have this idea, there really isn't a single definition of what it means to be a member of a professional that is universally accepted. But these three things that I have on the slide here are key. Firstly, we've got this idea that there is a special skill or learning that only people who are members of the profession can share. Special skills and learning. So in relation to lawyers, here we're talking about qualifications as a lawyer, what you're doing now, undertaking a law degree, which in Australia requires you to complete 11 subjects. We call them the Priestley 11. This subject is one of them. You need to do more than the Priestley 11, but the Priestley 11, named after a committee that was chaired by somebody called, you guessed it, Priestley, identifies 11 core subject areas that need to be covered. And one of them is legal ethics. So we cover that element of the Priestley 11 in this subject, although you will, I hope, come across ethics in a range of other subjects as well. The second one is this idea of public service, that there is some kind of good, greater good for the community that comes out of this little bit eager there, that comes out of this particular activity. So doctors heal people, that's good. Medicine is a profession. Engineers, they ensure that structures stand up. They design bridges. That is a profession, special skill, some sort of general good. Architects would also consider themselves a profession, as would accountants. The last one is probably the one when you've got least business experience, is the hardest to necessarily understand. This idea of autonomy or self-regulation. Things are going wrong for me today. And I think that's one that is worth actually just reflecting on. This idea that professions are, or members of a profession are best placed to understand the value that they bring and the complexity and intricacies of the way that they work. And as a consequence, there is always a risk when somebody is dealing with somebody who is a member of a profession that there will be what an economist might call a moral hazard. That because you don't know enough about the workings of your spleen or your liver or your lungs, that if a doctor tells you that you need surgery to deal with a particular illness that you have, you've got no way of actually knowing whether or not that is true. And so it's very difficult then for a regulator to regulate the ways in which surgery should be conducted. Now, that's not to say that in this modern day and age that doesn't happen. Of course it does now, and well, I hope it does. But we need people who are experts in the profession to be able to help inform and guide members of the profession as to what is required to admit someone to that profession. So what should those special skills and learnings comprise of? And what is the best way to do something? So legal practice itself has long been described as a profession, and in fact that idea of profession actually antedates the scholarly debate over what a profession even is. So as scholars or academics have been saying, well, being a mechanic is or is not a profession, I think it would possibly fit into this kind of criteria, but maybe not. In working out what it means to be a professional, those academics have drawn on what it is that lawyers in fact do, because lawyers have been seen as members of a profession for a very long time. So it becomes a little bit circular. A broader definition of a lawyer could be someone who has graduated with academic qualifications in law, priestly 11 subjects included, in one of the courses which form one of the qualifications of becoming a member of the profession. So in order to become a member of the profession, to become a qualified Australian legal practitioner, then you need to have completed a law degree, and that in fact incorporates these particular legal subjects, the priestly 11, and that's going to set you apart from a person who studied legal studies or law subjects as part of another law discipline. As a matter of history, actually, law was previously studied as part of an apprenticeship system. You used to be able to become a lawyer effectively by sitting at the knee of another lawyer, an already qualified lawyer. The articles system in some way continued for a very long time, and we now tend to think of what used to be articles and which has now become a much more sophisticated professional legal education program, the PLT program, as being a way of transitioning from the theory of law into the practice of law. So moving from the why you do things to the how you do things. So historically, you could be an article, or you could take on pupillage or reading with a barrister. So, and a person who was a pupil or a reader or an article clerk would learn under the tutelage of that experienced solicitor or barrister, and they would usually do some academic study at the same time. Law schools have been around in Australia since the 1850s. In fact, the law school I went to, Sydney University, was the first law school in Australia. 8 years later, Melbourne Law School began, and really in the last 10 years or so, there's been a real growth in the different universities that are offering law programs. And RMIT itself has offered a Juris Doctor, so a postgraduate law degree for some time, and much more recently, its LLB program. Up until about the 20th century, the 20th century really even into the first third of the 20th century, it was pretty hard for anybody who wasn't, well, in Australia anyway, who wasn't a man and who wasn't a white man to become a lawyer. But that's changed significantly since, and we'll talk about those changes as we move on today. It's worth actually thinking about how we perceive what a lawyer is as well. I haven't prescribed the reading, but one of the texts that I have looked at when I've been preparing for you, I haven't prescribed in the reading in part because it is only available in hard copy, but there are some copies on reserve in the library if you want to have a look at it. So Lamb, Littridge and Murray have had a good look at the question of how does the public perceive lawyers, and how does that impact the way we think about them? Now, one of the things we know is that lawyers can be the butt of jokes. Like there is this kind of social perception that lawyers are clever, but they're kind of somehow sneaky and snaky. And, you know, the lawyer jokes, I have a little book of lawyer jokes somewhere, but there's a kind of common theme that the lawyer is, you know, just trying to get money out of people and basically distorting the truth in some way. And so basically, if we think about that hired gun or mouthpiece idea, we often think that there is this kind of connection in the social world anyway, of this, the lawyer as being somehow amoral or unethical. Now, my experience is actually vastly different from that, but I don't want to pretend that there aren't amoral or unethical lawyers out there. And certainly, even when lawyers are very ethical, they may be perceived by the rest of the world to be in some ways amoral or lacking in a moral compass or in moral sense. I think that comes in part because it is very hard for somebody who has not thought about it in any detail, and you will be thinking about it in detail if you haven't already, to think about the difference between law and justice. Somebody can be a law-abiding citizen and follow the law very, very clearly and never be a good person. Similarly, when the law is applied, it doesn't always result in a just outcome. And so it's very easy for people looking from the outside to think, well, why is it that a person would represent the bad guys, represent somebody that they know is guilty, take the side of an amoral cause in some way, particularly when we're looking at laws that are being made about things that we might have very, very strong opinions about. Let me use an example, or a couple of examples from the USA. One of the things that we often see is this real disconnect in relation to carrying guns, which for us in Australia and in many parts of the world, we just cannot understand. Now, clearly there's a cultural piece there, but there is embedded into the Constitution of the USA this right to bear arms. And the way that that has been interpreted over the years makes it very difficult to make laws that would eradicate gun use in the US. Now, you may have a strong opinion about that, pro or anti guns. Similarly, about other moral issues that come up all the time, you know, the right to terminate a pregnancy, for example. It is complex to make laws, and it is complex to respond to laws in over time, particularly as the world changes. But we have this, we can have this perception that lawyers really, particularly those who take a position to enforce or create a law that we don't agree with, are somehow immoral. I think too, this shows out, Morgan polls have been polling the trustworthiness of different professions for many, many years. Lawyers tend to not come out well. We tend to come, we're a little bit more trustworthy than politicians, many of whom are lawyers, and let's face it, they are lawmakers, and real estate agents and used car salesmen, but we're not very high amongst people that can trust. That can also be the information asymmetry, or that moral hazard that arises when we know more about our clients' needs in relation to the law than they do. So there can be this sense of overcharging or over-servicing or creating problems that aren't necessarily there. So we also have this image, and again, Littrich and Lamb pull down these kind of these categories, and I'm just drawing from their work when I'm going to talk about this idea of the lawyer as a distorter of truth. The lawyer as a distorter of truth is this kind of view that really comes from the idea of the adversarial system. Now, again, in the reading that you do have, the Christine Parker and Adrian Evans' book, the first chapter really sets up this idea of the adversarial advocate. And this idea of it being the lawyer's duty to look after the interests of their clients no matter what. Now, the role of lawyers is to represent their client and to persuade a court to come to a view that and to apply justice on the basis of evidence that is presented before it, which is in that client's favour. The lawyer's job is not to find the truth. The lawyer's job is not to find justice. The lawyer's job is to represent and to put the client's best case forward. Now, as you will learn, that means they can't distort the truth. So this is an unfair representation. They cannot distort the truth. They cannot make up things. They cannot leave out relevant evidence or not advise the court of relevant or applicable laws. But it's absolutely what they should be doing to put the best case forward. Of course, for those of us who are transaction lawyers, we are also seen as generators of paper, particularly those of us who work in-house. We are not kind to the trees, my friends. We are not quite kind to the trees. Whether it's in transactional work or litigation, words on paper are our currency. This is one of the reasons why it is so important that your written and spoken language are superior if you really want to succeed at the law. The process of drafting, analysing, organising documents, that is the day-to-day work of legal practitioners. And somebody who is not a lawyer can see this as, a mountain that they'd really not rather climb. I've had so many clients over the years who basically just shoved a contract in my direction and said, is that okay? And actually, I can't do that. I can't tell whether it's okay or not because a contract is going to represent their agreement. And I don't make the agreement. I can document the agreement. I can analyse the agreement. I can tell them whether or not the agreement matches their expectations. But in order to do any of those things, I have to understand the deal that they've made or that they want to make. Paper records are clearly a really key part of the practice of law, and it's going to be really important that you understand that. The next one, they use this rather charming idea of the lawyer as a sorcerer. Now, why they use it, I think it's charming. Think back to your days of loving Harry Potter. There are so many pieces of legal jargon that basically sound like magic spells. My favourite Latin expression is re ipsa loquitur. What does that mean? It means the words speak for themselves. So if the words were as clear as that, why wouldn't you say them in English? But yeah, we are hammered with this idea that we use legal jargon, we use technical terms in a particular way. And in some ways that is a fair way of thinking about what it is that we do, and in other ways it's really unfair. Why is it fair? As I mentioned before, words are the tool of our trade. We are precise when we use language. You will, if you haven't already learned, that it is really important when you are writing contracts to be consistent in the language. So we have a rule, again, it has a Latin name, Justum Generis. So essentially when we gather things together of a particular ilk, then we will treat the list in a particular way. When we use different words that mean the same thing, a court will presume that we meant different things by those words, because why wouldn't we have used the same word otherwise? So it is important for us to be precise, but we don't need to hide behind technical language in order to do our job well. And in fact, more and more the profession is recognising that by using plain English, we are de-risking our profession, because if our clients who've paid a lot of money for our services, let's face it, can understand what it is that we do for them, then they are more likely to be able to tell us if we've believe it or not, misunderstood something along the way. So yeah, it does feel like voodoo magic to other people, but at the end of the day, that's what you're doing a law firm to learn, is actually about that precise language, about where you find the information that you need to identify or to solve a legal problem, and the analysis skills that you might use to make sense of that problem and to prepare advice. I think the other one that we see, particularly on social media. Maybe we see it on social media, but in popular culture, is the lawyer as the hero. Comes in at the last minute to save the day, finds the smoking gun. I mean, this is the stuff that great TV and movies are made of. Probably my favourite lawyer as a hero would be Atticus Finch from Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. But there are plenty of others that you might see. And of course, there's the dramatic courtroom scenes. Again, I've been a transaction lawyer all my time. I have not spent a lot of time in court. And my experience of court, and it could be because I was never senior enough as an advocate, is it's actually pretty boring. There's a lot of waiting, a lot of talking, a lot of mumbling. There isn't the kind of big aha moment that you might see when, the wonderful Elle realised that the witness had a perm and so couldn't possibly have dealt with whatever the scene was if her hair was wet. That's a really bad analogy. I should brush up on Legally Blonde before I continue. And of course, I mentioned the butt of jokes beforehand. So we can think about the law in these ways, but we as lawyers, none of these really sum up what it is that we do. And so when we think about what it is that the world thinks we do, we can start with those things, but also think yourself, what is it that you think or want to be doing? Now, of course, I think these guys and this series, this might remind us of the adversarial advocate, aggressive benders of truth, perhaps, certainly finding ways to represent their clients and deal with the legal dilemmas that they are dealing with efficiently, dramatically. Maybe you would call these guys lawyers as hero, I'm not sure. I watched a little bit of the Lincoln Lawyer series on Netflix recently. Again, lawyer as hero, that's definitely how he casts himself, but very much this character is very much someone who would fit in that adversarial role. I mentioned before that this would be one of my favourite, and I don't think we really understand how radical the hero was when this movie and the novel before it came out. And, not all heroes are tall, good-looking white men. They might, in fact, be Julia Roberts here playing Erin Brockovich, you might remember. The scrappy fighter made good using brains to essentially help other people. So that's what popular culture is going to tell us that lawyering is. But what do we think lawyering is? What does the profession of lawyers say that lawyering is? This definition, is a good starting point. Lawyering is the work of a specially skilled, knowledgeable or experienced person who, serving by mutual agreement as another person's agent, invokes and manipulates or advises about the dispute resolving or transaction effectuating process of the legal system for the purpose of solving a problem or causing a desired change in or the preserving of the status quo for his or her principal. What does that mean? What do you think it means? At the end of the day, what I think what they're trying to say is that somebody does legal work, or doing legal work, lawyering, involves advising someone, a principal, on a dispute or a transaction, and applying the law to do that. And they're doing that to solve a problem, to bring about a change, or to ensure that things stay the same for the person you're acting for. So already this definition, you need a lawyer to actually pull it apart, but it uses this idea of a person's agent and principal. And again, that is a legal concept that you may or may not have come across before. Clearly, it's my clicker that's giving me a hard time today. You may not have come that before, but a principal is the person who on whose behalf an agent acts. So the place where you are most likely to have seen an agent in real life is your landlord is represented by an agent. The landlord, or the person who owns the house or the unit that you are renting, engages an agent, and the agent acts for the benefit of the principal. So you have a contract with the agent, but you have a contract with the principal, with the landlord. You probably never even meet them. What happens is that the agent basically takes that contract to you. The agent answers your questions. The agent is the one who makes promises to you. The agent is the one who facilitates things happening or not happening. Similarly, if you're buying and selling a house, or your parents are, the agent acts for the principal. So we often say when we're looking to buy houses, I spoke to my agent. They're not your agent. If you're looking to buy, they're the agent of the person who is selling. So, okay, that's another way of saying lawyers do legal work. And legal work is those things. It's advising someone. So not necessarily yourself, you're doing it for someone else. You're applying the law to solve a problem, bring about change, or to make sure that your client's circumstances don't change. So lawyers are the people who do that. So what is a lawyer? Section 6 of the Uniform Law says that an Australian lawyer is a person who is admitted to the Australian legal profession in this jurisdiction or another jurisdiction. So what's an Australian legal practitioner? That's an Australian lawyer. And it's an Australian lawyer who holds a current practicing certificate. Pretty circular. You need a lawyer to tell you what a lawyer is, right? Another way of looking at it is Butterworth's Legal Dictionary that says a barrister or a solicitor. A lawyer is a barrister or a solicitor. It's a person, either of them is a person qualified to practice law. So a lawyer is someone who's once again we get back to lawyer is someone who does legal work, but we've added in this idea, it's not just does legal work, but they do so because they have a qualification to do so, and they hold a practicing certificate, which means that they're complying with the laws that relate to the giving of legal advice. So in other words, a lawyer is a lawyer. So surely we can get a better definition than that. And I'd like to make sure that by the end of this lecture, we come away with a much better definition. Just a little sidebar. I just mentioned the Uniform Law a second ago. If you're looking at this on a screen, you can pop your phone on that QR code and you can go straight to the Uniform Law if you wish to. But it can be a little bit confusing because when you're looking for it, I mean, we're studying in Victoria and our focus is on the Victorian law, but you'll find that the Uniform Law is actually a New South Wales law, mostly. So the Uniform Law, it's now in effect in New South Wales, Victoria, and fairly recently now Western Australia. And it's been a project to harmonise the regulation of the profession in order to cut red tape and create a single system to govern legal practice. Clearly we don't have a single system yet because, as I said, Victoria, New South Wales, Western Australia, that still leaves a number of states and territories to get on board. It's a scheme that promotes informed consumer choice and it includes strong consumer protection measures. I'm not saying it's better than what the other states have, but it's what we do have. And when you think about it, in the order of 80%, possibly more now that Western Australia has come on board, of actual lawyers are covered by the Uniform Law because New South Wales and Victoria between them have the greatest number of lawyers by some distance. So the Uniform Law, its approach is to achieve some kind of consistency between the states and territories in the laws that apply to the profession, to ensure legal practitioners are competent and that they maintain high ethical and professional standards. One of its goals was to enhance the protection of clients and the public. And as you look at some of the older cases and read the text, you'll see that actually you often need a lawyer to protect you from your lawyer. And really that's something that needs to change or needed to change, and I think has been embraced by the profession for the most part. It's also about efficient, effective, targeted and proportionate regulation so that we as lawyers are not also drowning in red tape and making it really difficult for us to do our job. And to provide for a co-regulatory framework with appropriate independence for the profession. So remember, just a minute ago, we were talking about how the profession regulates itself. A profession is something that regulates itself. And so clearly the lawyers, the profession, have had a great deal of input into the way that the law has been developed. And then the professional bodies actually regulate, to apply those laws for the most part. There are certain jurisdiction-specific arrangements, for example, the operation of local authorities and fees, things like that. But as I mentioned before, New South Wales, Victoria and Western Australia are now covered by the Uniform Law. I also want to talk about this idea of what an Australian lawyer is. Would an Australian lawyer by another name do something different? So historically we've talked about barristers and solicitors. These slides will be available for you. I'm not going to read the notes for you. You can do that yourself. But I just wanted to point out that traditionally lawyers have practiced and been referred to as either barristers or solicitors. So if we're thinking about this as a kind of Venn diagram, all barristers and all solicitors are lawyers, but not all lawyers are barristers and not all lawyers are solicitors. Some solicitors are also barristers, but many barristers are not solicitors. So over the last 20 years or so, we've had a number of moves towards a kind of national consistency in the way that we regulate the profession, but we haven't ended up with that kind of uniform approach. So these terms are still really important. It's also important to think about this idea of whether you are admitted as a solicitor or a barrister. And we will talk about admission in the coming weeks. That will be quite an important part of what we're going to canvass. And when we're talking about admission, it's not holding a practicing certificate. It is actually entering the profession, being entered as a solicitor or entered onto the role of solicitors or the role of barristers. Actually, in South Australia, it's a single role, which makes it a little bit more complex. In Victoria, solicitors have always had the appearance rights, so they have been able to do advocacy work, and so many have framed themselves as barrister and solicitor. Where in New South Wales, historically, since almost the very beginning of the legal practice there, barristers and solicitors have kept very, very separate. So what I've put here is a QR code on the screen. Again, if you're looking at this on your phone, it's not going to be useful to you, but it's there in the notes for you to have a look at, with an excellent page from the Victorian Barristers VLAB, the admission board for barristers, which has a really nice summary about the differences between solicitors and barristers and gives you some really succinct and good points, particularly about what it is that barristers do. So now that we've thought about what an Australian lawyer is, I think actually I've just made all those points on this slide when I was talking about the other one. There you go. I just want to make sure that you understand that there's a difference between being admitted as a lawyer and being able to practice as a lawyer. It's not enough to just get admitted. but you also have to have a current practicing certificate and in a relevant jurisdiction, and that practicing certificate needs to be of the type that allows you to practice in the way that you wish to practice. So it needs to give you permissions to act as a barrister if that's what you want to do, or as a solicitor, for example. If you wish to actually run your own firm, then you need what is called a full practicing certificate, where you have the ability to act as principal. For many of us, we will have that at some points in our lives, but in other points, like me presently, I have an employee practicing certificate for the firm that I work for because I'm no longer running my own firm and I don't need trust account rights. So an Australian lawyer, there is a difference between some Australian lawyers will just be admitted lawyers, others will be legal practitioners entitled to practice as either a barrister or a solicitor under their practicing certificate. So that's a long-winded way of saying that lawyers are professionals who do legal work. And brings us right back to that question we keep asking, what is the nature of legal work? So we can cut and dice this in lots of ways. We've already spoken about solicitors, barristers, but also let's add into the mix here judges. Judges do legal work, and while they're not solicitors or barristers, we need to actually incorporate them in there. Solicitors, we can think about them, they do legal work in private practice, but they might also be in-house. So they might be employed by a company and they have essentially one client, the company that they advise, and so we call them corporate practitioners. They might also be working in government, for example. Now, this is really... So another way of thinking about the nature of legal work is by thinking about the end outcome. Is the legal work relating to something litigious, to a dispute, or is it transactional, the making of an agreement or the creation of a law? It's, the actual outcome can be very different there. We're resolving disputes or we are creating new ways of doing things. But the actual actions are relatively similar. We're interpreting law, we're advising in relation to the law, we're still representing our clients, though clearly in a litigious sense that might involve advocacy, in a transactional sense that might include negotiation, for example. So you're going to be doing negotiation in a litigious sense as well. Reading and writing contracts, sure, in a transactional sense, but you'll be reading and writing pleadings and statements of evidence and briefs to counsel, etc., in a litigious sense, and ultimately orders. So the actual work might be similar, but the context could be different. Another way of thinking about where's it gone? So what did I do there? Oh, yep. We can also think about the actual day-to-day work that you're doing, so whether that's preparing documents or contracts, representation, research, etc., in the context of the industry or the type of client that you're representing or the type of law that you are applying is another way. So it's very rare for somebody to say, I'm a contract lawyer. They're more likely to say, I'm an employment lawyer or I'm an M&A lawyer. M&A is an acronym, M&A, mergers and acquisitions, which is just a fancy way of saying we buy and sell businesses. There's a little bit more to it than that, but not much when it comes to the acronym at least. It might be that you're a debt lawyer or a credit lawyer or a banking lawyer or a financial services lawyer. So we can think about it like the actual activities might be quite similar, but again, the context might be very different depending on the nature of your clients. Another thing is to think about legal work in terms of what you're actually doing at your desk from day to day. So you might be doing a lot of face-to-face time with people, or you might be spending a lot of time reading and writing documents. Regardless of what you're doing, you will be spending quite a lot of time with different forms of technology. In fact, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about technology, and we're going to launch straight in with the next module on talking about artificial intelligence. But you know what's the most important technology from your point of view right now? Every day, every lawyer that I know is spending time in a word processing software and email software. Being really good at being able to use those tools is taken as a given. Please excuse my dog scratching at the door. He's going to really annoy me. And so the different types of technologies that you use and really understanding how to use them competently and how they affect your duties is actually just part of lawyering. But let's face it, there are lots of people who use Microsoft Word and Outlook every day of their lives. They spend a lot of time on the phone. They spend a lot of time in meetings. More and more they're online meetings these days. But they also spend a lot of time reading and a lot of time writing and a lot of time analysing other people's writing. So if you don't like reading things and if you don't like writing, and particularly writing in a very structured kind of way, you might want to start thinking about whether or not this is the game you really want to play in. So what does this all mean? I think that there are a couple of things we can say for sure now. Lawyers are people who do legal work, and legal work is the kind of work that lawyers do. And if you're not a lawyer and you do legal work, then you're going to get fined, and those fines are big. So this all comes from Section 9 of the Uniform Law, and well, Section 10 provides for the fines, and you can see there that as at 2022, you're looking at a fine of a bit more than $46,000 if you engage in legal practice and you're not qualified to do so, and that may, in addition to, or it could be either or both, 46 odd grand, up to 2 years in jail. And a person who you do that legal work for doesn't have to pay you. In fact, you have to give the money back. Okay, so legal work is the work that lawyers do. Lawyers are people who have a legal qualification and who do legal work. And if you don't have that qualification and a matching practicing certificate to go with it, then you're committing an offence. Okay, so how do we work out exactly what legal work is? Well, in a nutshell, legal work is the kind of work that lawyers normally do. So legal work is the work that the profession considers to be legal work. I suspect that will change over time, and that's something that you need to think about. I mean, 10 years ago, nobody was thinking about cryptocurrencies and whether or not they were currencies or whether they were securities or whether they were securitized interests of some sort. That kind of legal work and advice is being done every day now. And that's an example of how the nature of the work that we do is impacted by the world around us. When I started in the profession, only lawyers did conveyancing, and conveyancing here, when used as a verb, it could mean a range of things, but here I mean basically everything to do with the transfer of real property from one person or entity to another. But now that's largely done by persons who are not lawyers. It's done by people who are licensed under the relevant conveyancing legislation. The Part 2.1 of the Uniform Law does help us a little bit to work out what legal practice is by telling us what are the exceptions to legal practice. So it doesn't say these things are not legal practice. It says actually it's not an offence if you fit within one of these buckets to do legal work. So the first one might not be immediately obvious to you. So independent legal practices, so companies that have been incorporated and been given a license to be an independent legal practice, and community legal centres, they are an exception. Now, why is that? Because essentially the law says only a lawyer who has a qualification can do legal work. Now, a company is a person, but clearly a company can't go and get itself a law degree. And so a company that is an incorporated legal practice or a community legal centre that employs people who have practicing certificates, in other words, people who have the qualifications, have been admitted to practice, and then also have a practicing certificate. They are the ones who are technically doing the work. If you haven't already done company law, you will understand that the work that is done by a company or by the employees of a company is done by those people on behalf of the company, belongs to the company, and it is treated as being done by the company, even though the company is actually not a physical thing in any way. And so that's why that exception is there. Foreign lawyers practicing foreign law. So if I, for example, was a qualified lawyer in France and I came to Australia to advise the wine industry on dealing with purchasers in France or vendors in France, and I'm advising on how the law of contract in France works. Even though I'm in Australia and I'm doing legal work, as long as I limit the advice that I give to the laws of France, where I am qualified to practice, then I'm not qualified to practice there, by the way, I'm making this up. But if I were not qualified to practice in Australia, that's okay. So again, there are some hoops you have to jump through, but foreign lawyers practicing foreign law is an exception. There are some other things as well. So a person who prepares an enterprise agreement or an agreement-based transitional instrument within the meaning of the Commonwealth Fair Work legislation. So somebody who works for a union, for example, or for a company in an enterprise bargaining situation, they are... Clearly, we must think of it as illegal work, but it is an exception. I mentioned before, licensees under the Conveyances Act who perform conveyancing work in accordance with that Act, that's an exception. If you have leave of a court to represent somebody in that court, then that's an exception that applies. And in fact, solicitors who don't have that advocacy often need to get the leave of the court to appear, depending again on the jurisdiction. And people who do anything in the course of their employment with the Crown or a public authority or in the performance of duties under an appointment by the government in council. So lawmakers may in fact not be lawyers. Interesting. That's all I have for you in this section. We're going to move on to the ways that the profession is changing next, and from there we will talk a little bit more about how the profession is regulated. So I'll see you in the next video.